Resident doctors in the UK, formerly called junior doctors, are set to go on a 5-day strike next week. They're calling for a 29% pay rise on top of last year's 22% deal, a demand that Health Secretary Wes Streeting has deemed unconscionable. And predictably, right-wing media has been quick to condemn striking doctors, with the Telegraph claiming they will, quote, bring the NHS to its knees. The latest to join that chorus is James O'Brien. Here he is on LBC.
Here's the thing I can't get past when it comes to the doctors. They get a 5.4% pay rise this year, which is more than almost everybody. And they got a 22% pay rise for the previous 2 years. And I fully appreciate that that you can crunch the numbers in a way that leaves them some way behind where they were in 2008. A helpful phrase alert, in real terms. But the way that lands in the country at the moment, I just think is so tin-eared. I'm casting myself today as quite a passionate opponent of this industrial action. At least I am at 9 minutes past 10. You know how this works. I could get to 15:15 and I've talked myself back round again, but I can't get past the numbers.
To unpack that argument, I'm now joined by Hope Worsdale of Just Treatment. Hi, Hope. We're going to begin with your view on the 29% pay rise that's being asked for.
Awesome. Thanks, Dahlia, for having me. So, we support doctors in their fight for fair pay conditions. We support all frontline health workers in this fight. And I think what James O'Brien's comments really are, they're part of a kind of quite concerted effort by politicians and the media to divide health workers and also to pit NHS patients against the people that provide care for us. So what doctors are asking for is to be paid at the same relative level that they were in 2008. And the BMA calculates that doctors' hourly pay has dropped from the equivalent of around £22 an hour in 2008 to about £17 an hour today. And that's including the recent pay increases that they had. Now, pundits like James O'Brien can make an abstract monologue about what level of increase is acceptable to demand, but none of that actually changes the reality of what's going on the ground in our crumbling health service. Because we are facing basically an existential staffing crisis in the NHS, which this government is not taking seriously at all. Over the last couple of years, we've lost tens of thousands of doctors from the NHS. And last year, the Nuffield Trust estimated that there were 1,400 unfilled doctor vacancies on any given day. And on top of that, a recent survey by the BMA found that up to a third of doctors are considering leaving as well. And it's actually not just about pay, worsening pay since 2008. It's also the conditions. Doctors, these people, they do not have the resources they need to look after us properly. They're rushing around every day. They're skipping breaks. They're going overtime. They're desperately trying to save patients that are dying in front of them with, crumbling hospitals and worsening equipment. So the reality is, if we don't improve the pay and conditions of our frontline health workers, many more will leave, and the state of our health service will deteriorate even further. And it's also not just doctors. Nurses are also considering taking strike action too. There's obviously been other, health workers such as paramedics that have taken strike action in recent years. And I think that is the kind of vital context that James O'Brien and many other talking heads are sort of conveniently leaving out of their hot takes.
The hottest of takes. Every time healthcare workers or any other essential worker goes on strike, we get this like, oh, can you believe they're being so greedy? We expect kind of doctors and nurses to be like these saints that will absorb any amount of sort of shock or any amount of deterioration because they are responsible for the healthcare of the public. And I've always said that it's really important to me that doctors and nurses and midwives that are looking after like me and my loved ones, I really want them to be like well rested, well taken care of. But just for argument's sake, the fact that, we often hear that these strikes are a threat to the general public, how do you expect these strikes to affect everyday people, especially given the state that the NHS is in right now?
Yeah, so just firstly on the point about public support. So it is true that public support has dropped in comparison to kind of previous rounds of strikes, but this has not happened in a vacuum. It's happened in the wake of a concerted campaign headed up by Wes Streeting, but backed by the government and also kind of clickbaity media pundits to try and paint doctors, the people who, as you say, Dahlia, are literally fighting every day to keep patients safe and alive, to paint them as greedy, as irresponsible, as demanding. And I was actually watching the James O'Brien clip earlier, and I thought this was a very interesting comment on the video from someone that said, if you say the doctors have just had a 22% pay rise in the recent past and no one else is getting near that, then support for them and the strike will drop. However, if you say that all they are asking for is £23 an hour for a job that involves daily decisions about living and dying, then support for the strike will probably rise. And I think, there are many ways that you can spin or portray these figures. And, I wonder why West Streeting and the government is trying their hardest to communicate these demands in the worst possible light. And, the narrative that this pay rise would be bigger and therefore unfair compared to other workers, it's kind of centered on this sort of really poisonous race to the bottom politics that's telling public sector workers, shut up, roll over and accept the terrible conditions that you are being subjected to. And we don't think that any public worker in the NHS and beyond should be expected to accept that. And so on your point about patient safety and disruption, so it's absolutely true. These strikes will cause disruption to patient care. That is the nature of industrial action. And for sure, that is very worrying and scary for many patients across the country, including a number of our supporters at Just Treatment. But the bigger picture here is that patient care is already being disrupted every single day because of more than a decade of relentless cuts, underfunding, and privatisation in our NHS. So way over 10,000 NHS patients are dying needlessly every single year because of delays to urgent care, whether that's, A&E waits or whether it's ambulance handover delays. And, many of the patients that we work with have lost loved ones in these horrific circumstances. They've had, their husband die in their arms. They've, watched their mum had a horrible fall at home and wait 11 hours and then die 2 days later from sepsis. These are real stories from patients across the country who are on the front line of the crisis in the NHS. But many of them still stand with health workers demanding better conditions because they recognise that this isn't actually just about pay. It is a fight for the very future of the NHS. And if we don't value health workers and give them the support and the resources they need to do their jobs, it's not just health workers that will lose out, it's all of us. It's every single one of us that either relies on the NHS every day or potentially could rely on the NHS at any moment. So, you hear a lot about from James O'Brien or from the government saying we can't afford to do this, but actually we would argue we can't afford to not do this because the potential implications of that are extremely grave and serious for us as patients.
I'm sorry to subject you to this, Hope, but let's take a look at another clip from James O'Brien.
I used to say to you that when a teacher tells me that they need to go on strike, I trust them because I also trust them with my child's welfare. When I hand my child over to teachers, I trust them with my child's life, ultimately, and therefore when they say that they need to go on strike, I should probably trust them with that as well. And I can kind of frame the same kind of attitude to doctors. But that's not actually quite as clever as I used to think it was either, is it? Because you could be the best teacher in the world, but a bit of an idiot when it comes to industrial action. It's not really about trust. I wouldn't necessarily trust a doctor to do something that's not doctorish. So just because I trust a doctor with my health, where I'm in need of an operation, doesn't mean that I'd trust him with financial advice or go to him for holiday tips. So is that stupid? Have I dropped another clanger there? Saying to you many, many times over the years that you should trust teachers and doctors when they say they have to go on strike because you trust them with other things in completely different circumstances.
What are you talking about? I mean, I would say that doctors are actually quite qualified to know when the conditions that they're working in are not sustainable anymore. I mean, Hope, are doctors not qualified to take industrial action?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is just totally bizarre because, frankly, whether James O'Brien trusts doctors to strike is actually irrelevant. I don't even think I know what that means. Doctors are workers, they have a right to strike, and they democratically voted to strike. And they are exercising that right because the government is catastrophically failing to address staffing shortages and the wider crisis in our NHS. And, this isn't something that health workers do all the time. Actually, it's happening in pretty extraordinary circumstances in relation to the state of our health service. And yeah, we completely agree, Dahlia, that in terms of understanding the state of our NHS and the reality of what it's like to try and provide care and save lives right now, these are the people that know it best alongside their, frontline health worker colleagues. And it's just a very desperate attempt right now by the media, but also by politicians to just kind of blame striking workers and blame health workers for everything. Blame them for the crisis in the NHS. Wes Streeting was in the media the other day saying that the resident doctor strikes would be a gift to Nigel Farage and Reform and would serve to, kind of like bolster them in the polls. And it's like, mate, you're the health secretary. You are literally the health secretary. It is your job to, kind of oversee the protection of the NHS, to tackle the crisis in the NHS. That's what you got elected to do. Yet you're here pointing the finger at the people that are desperately trying to hold it together day to day. Like, I'd love to see Wes Streeting last one day working on a ward in a crumbling hospital, So yeah, it's just really condescending, it's patronizing, and I think, a lot of the public, I hope and I would think, wouldn't fall for that kind of stuff.
Speaking of Wes Streeting, I'm going to ask you to kind of quickly comment on this. He suggested that he might look into writing off part of doctors' student debts to avert the strikes. Do you think that that is a fair substitute for pay increases?
I mean, I definitely don't think it's a substitute. I mean, obviously, doctors are having to pay a huge amount of interest on their very large loans that they have, come from kind of studying. So I'm sure that would make like a bit of a difference, but fundamentally that can't be a substitute for sort of like proper pay and conditions. And I think that, I would follow the BMA's lead in sort of how they respond to that and how their members decide what's good enough for them or not. And, we trust them to know their worth. And it's very important that we treat them as such.
Hope, thank you so much for joining me. Helena, what do you make of some of those hot takes from James O'Brien, the one that I've subjected everyone to two of in this show? I mean, you should take me out and flog me for it.
I mean, there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The first one is this idea that we keep talking about different sectors of society who are in some ways useful and the other sectors of society aren't as useful. And we talk about them in different ways, right? So what I'm talking about here is a distinction between the super rich and doctors. When you suggest, oh, well, we should tax millionaires and billionaires more, we should tax the super rich more, the immediate reaction from our media establishment is to say, oh, but if you tax them, we'll leave. If you don't let them have all of the wealth in the world, all of subsumed within themselves, they'll leave and then we won't get access to all of the amazing things they bring to society, such as leeching off of the rest of us, right? Like, when it comes to doctors, when they legitimately ask for pay restoration, when of course the reality is that international markets decide what is and isn't the going rate for doctors. And if they don't get adequate remuneration or indeed the conditions necessary for them to want to stick around in the NHS, Australia is beckoning. It is beckoning with higher salaries and better working conditions and less shitty weather, right? There are plenty of good reasons why doctors can and do go to different countries for better conditions and better pay. And yet we never hear about this. All we hear is selfish doctors undermining the NHS. They're going to let patients die if they don't call off their strike action. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Think of what's going to happen to the public realm if we just allow millionaires to get off scot-free. Suddenly, the interest of them in terms of their international mobility is not called into question at all when it comes to doctors. And doctors are far, far, far more important for the functioning of our society than millionaires and billionaires are. Yet they don't get any of the same discussion of their mobility, unlike when it comes to millionaires and billionaires who do not provide any use to society whatsoever in terms of the utility of the role that they play internally. It's really, really, really hypocritical in terms of the coverage of these two things. The second of all is that James O'Brien talks about, oh, well, the public finances, they're in a terrible position. Wes Streeting says, well, we can't afford it. The NHS budgets can't stretch to increase doctor salaries, raise taxes. raise taxes, right? Perfectly reasonable to raise taxes. But of course, Labour can't do that because they spent their entire time pandering to middle class people and saying, no, it's fine. We won't raise your taxes. We're just going to raise a very, very small amount. Oh, there's a £20 billion black hole. We're going to have to raise some taxes, but not any more than that. They could make a positive case for extra expenditure. And the reality is that especially in an inflationary environment where we can't justify, increasing the money supply if you wanted to do more spending without raising taxes, in the inflationary environment, if you want to spend more, you're going to have to raise at least some taxes to be able to do that. But then again, who would be the person who would get hit most by an increasing on taxes? Oh, it would be someone like James O'Brien, who gets paid money hand over fist to spout often uninformed opinions on LBC. He'd be the person who'd be hit by such a tax rise. And that's why they don't want to talk about it. Oh, the public finances are in such a bad place, the public sector have to just deal with not having pay restoration. When the reality is that we should and could have a better funded, better paid public sector that means we're internationally competitive in terms of salary. But the reality is that people like James would have to pay more in tax, and he cannot entertain that for 1 second.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. Also, when we say tax the rich, when we say we want a wealth tax, I think sometimes people think that we're talking about people like doctors who, especially like later on in their career, earn like a middle class salary, or that we're talking about kind of lawyers and things like that. We're talking about people with astronomical amounts of wealth that most of us could never even imagine being anywhere near, wealth that is not being reinvested into the economy, wealth that is not being reinvested into us, is being generated up by us, but is being held in shell companies, in offshore territories, and just being passed down from one generation to the other within the same family. And so we are punishing exactly the wrong people for our economic crisis, for the black hole in public finances. We're punishing public sector workers rather than people who have been making a killing over our crappy, wholly kind of not fit for purpose tax system, and for the lack of backbone that our political class have when it comes to people who are hoarding astronomical amounts of wealth that they could never feasibly spend within their lifetime, their children's lifetime, their grandchildren's lifetime. And it's so disgusting to see someone like James O'Brien, who I don't know how much he earns, but I know he earns more than the 30 to 40 grand a year that junior doctors earn. And we can live without James O'Brien. We can't live without junior doctors. So explain to me, like I'm 5, why we would design an economy that rewards the James O'Briens of the world probably 3-4 times the amount that we're rewarding the junior doctors of the world, junior doctors who train for up 7 to 10 years, who leave university with so much debt, and who have to go through genuinely quite traumatic things in a normal workday. It doesn't make any sense, but I guess James O'Brien has to come up with all kinds of reasons why he should be being paid what he's being paid when junior doctors, which is being subsidized, by the way, by cuts to public sector workers, because it's by not taxing the super rich that it's by cutting public sector wages that we are able to continue not taxing the super rich. So essentially, with our wage stagnation, we are subsidizing the huge wealth that the super rich have.